Hello and welcome to Bangalore International Centre's very own podcast, BIC Talks. Bangalore International Centre is a platform for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, and a space for arts and culture. BIC Talks brings the essence of all that the physical space stands for and more to your doorstep.
How can we reduce gigatons upon gigatons of global greenhouse gas emissions? And why should we do it here in India? Sweta Daga speaks to Zaid Hassan about it on this episode of BIC Talks. Zaid is the co-founder of the Complexity University and 10 in 10. He has been tackling complex social challenges globally for 20 years now, including work on climate change action. Sweta Daga is a storyteller and facilitator and has worked as a freelance journalist at the intersection of climate justice, gender, and equity. Hi Zaid, hi Sweta. Welcome to BIC Talks. It's a pleasure to have you both on this podcast.
Hi Pavan, thanks for having us.
Yeah, good to be here. Thank you.
And Sweta, the floor is yours entirely.
Okay, so we'll just jump right in. A good place to start would actually be talking to Zaid about why he even got involved in the climate crisis right now. How did you start your journey before we move into any of the technicalities? So yeah, I'm curious as to why would you decide to do this on purpose?
Right. Well, as most modern stories start, it started with an email. So I got an email from one of my colleagues saying that he had had an inquiry from a group that needed some help, a climate group that needed some help. And at the time I had set up an organization that was essentially a consulting organization, but we helped groups tackle complex challenges. Anyway, what the email said was there were a group of climate activists who were trying to prep for the COP, the UN essentially conference parties where the UN comes together once a year, and they were stuck and they needed some help, and they were in Austria. Did I want to go and help? And I said, sure. So I ended up in Austria, and the group was called the Climate Action Network. And the Climate Action Network is essentially a global coalition of climate NGOs. So they include all the big organizations like, WWF and Oxfam and so on. And they also include lots of grassroots organizations from the Global South and other places. And so I sort of turned up in Austria. They showed me this agenda, and it was this packed 3-day kind of agenda with every minute packed. And they said, what do you think? And I looked at it and I said, well, I wouldn't do this if I were you. And they were like, why? I said, because the thing that you're disagreeing with isn't on the agenda. It's like they had put everything in except the issue that they had a conflict around. Anyway, so I ended up redesigning the agenda, and I worked with the group to try and kind of unblock them. And basically that was the beginning of my work in the climate space. And I ended up doing a lot more work for the Climate Action Network. And basically what I was trying to do was trying to help them come to alignment and agreement before they went into the climate negotiations, essentially as a civil society kind of lobbying group. And that was really my induction, if you like, into the climate space and into understanding climate space, understanding the policy space, understanding what was happening, what was not working, and so on.
When was this?
This is, I don't know, maybe a decade ago. Yeah, I would say kind of a decade ago. So the Copenhagen talks were in 2009. So it was a couple of years before that. So I'd say probably 2007, maybe. So quite a while ago.
So you've been at this for at least 10 years, if not more. And before that, you just spoke about a complex challenge in your sentence, the thing that you said. And my next question is, it's very obvious. Isn't every challenge complex, right? What do you mean by complex challenge?
In some ways, every challenge is complex or part of greater complexity. What I mean by kind of a complex challenge, and if you like a non-complex challenge, is that we tend to ignore the complexity and pay attention to it and turn challenges into, if you like, technical challenges. So a technical challenge is a challenge where people generally agree what the nature of the problem is and what the nature of the solution is, even if we don't have the technical know how to do it. And then we hand it to experts, and then the experts come up with a solution. So it might be, we want to put someone on the moon and we need to build a rocket. We don't know how to build a rocket, but we agree that, these are the parameters of the problem and the solution. And then we hand that to experts, and they will spend, a decade or two working on it, and they'll come up with some sort of technical solution and response. The problem with that approach when we apply it to things on Earth, so that works when you want to put a man on the moon or somebody on the moon, and there are no really kind of no unintended consequences, but it doesn't work with industrial systems. It doesn't work with systems that involve people. So, for example, I'm sure we've all seen pictures of plastic waste in the oceans where there's beaches with tens of thousands of tons of plastic waste washed up. So that plastic waste, if you like, is the product of treating complex systems as if they're non-complex. So no one intends for that plastic waste to end up on the beach, but it becomes a consequence of ignoring, if you like, the complexity of the challenges in our industrial systems. And unfortunately, we have probably kind of over a century, 100 years of doing that, where modernity has essentially taught us we started out by ignoring, if you like, the unintended consequences of these challenges because they were pretty small initially. And that approach doesn't really work anymore. So really the challenge is that, yes, the world we live in is by nature complex, but we've ignored that reality for a long, long time because we didn't really have to deal with it. And now we are unfortunately having to deal with it.
And how does this apply to the climate crisis right now?
So, one of the characteristics, if you like, of a complex challenge over a technical challenge is that the problem definition, if you like, is disputed. So the very nature of the problem is in dispute. And then the nature of the solutions are also in dispute. So it isn't as if you can take the problem and the solution definition, if you like, and hand it to a bunch of experts and say, solve this problem, because the very nature of the crisis is a dispute. And I think one of the mistakes that happened early in the climate movement, if you like, was that really kind of the UN process that is currently underway was modeled on something called the Montreal Protocol, which was essentially around reducing CFCs and fixing the ozone problem. And, CFCs came out of refrigerants and they came out of a very small kind of class of products. And it was pretty easy to treat that as a technical problem where, we know what the problem is and the solution is to stop these CFCs, if you like, from being emitted in the atmosphere. Unfortunately, greenhouse gases are not like CFCs. They are emitted by everything that humans do. So we made, if you like, there's a guy at Harvard called Ronald Heifetz who teaches this stuff, adaptive leadership, and he calls it the classic error. We mistook, if you like, a very complex challenge for a technical challenge. And we made a very, very elementary, if you like, category mistake. And climate change is such a complex challenge because every facet of our lives and our society is producing greenhouse gases. And it doesn't require a simple technical shift. It requires more substantial changes and shifts.
Well, I have two questions on this. One is that we're speaking to you from Bangalore, so we're in India. So number one is we had very little to do with this sitting in India. But the other question I have is I keep hearing about all these magical technical solutions that are going to be there. So why not use them?
As in what? Why is this really a problem? Why won't we just come up with a technical fix and it'll be solved, or a technology that will solve the problem? Is that what you mean?
I saw this thing, a post that Elon Musk is donating or giving $100 million or something ridiculous to somebody who comes up with the best way to capture carbon. And the snarky response was, good job to anyone who invents forests, which is funny. But I'm actually asking, what couldn't we actually develop something like that?
So obviously, in theory, we could invent a magical technology that, solves all our problems and sucks carbon out of the atmosphere. And that is obviously the technocratic utopian dream that, we as humans are smart enough, clever enough, innovative enough that we'll just invent a technology that will mean that we can just continue doing what we're doing and we'll just kind of suck greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. So there's kind of one problem with that, which is, so there's, Jared Diamond right there. So he asked his students this question that, on Easter Island, where the population went extinct, and they went extinct because they cut down all the trees and deforested the entire island. So they didn't really have any fuel or food, or, they couldn't grow anything. He says, what were they thinking when they cut down the last tree? So, they deforest the island. There's one tree left. So what are they thinking? And so he asked his students to kind of come up with responses and says, well, what were they thinking? And, one of my favorite ones is technology will save us. So they cut down the last tree and they say, we're going to come up with a technical solution. We're going to solve the problem. And it's like, no, you're not. And they go extinct. So one way of thinking about, what Musk is doing and really that technocratic will come up with a solution is that it's a bet. It's like gambling. It's like a wager. And so we're making a wager that, we will either go off the cliff and we will destroy civilization and the planet, or we will come up with a fix and we will solve it. And that's not a good wager to make. It's sort of like playing Russian roulette with the planet and with humanity and civilization, which is that would be great, but it is not that simple. And if we fail at coming up with this technological solution, then the consequences of that failure are going to be high. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is that, people see technology often kind of as a solution to our problems, that, we have laptops, or we have electricity, or we have, pesticide, we have agriculture, we have fertilizers, we have pesticides, all sorts of things. And the thing about technology is that, so I studied physics early in my career. And one of the things that I guess thought was that, every technology that we invent has a shadow side and has unintended consequences. And often we are blind to those unintended consequences. So, we have electricity, but we're burning coal, and that coal is producing CO2 and particulates and pollution. We have laptops and we have the internet, but, we are mining rare minerals, and, millions of people are working as slaves in mines. And there are obviously massive environmental consequences. There are tailings ponds where there's massive pollution that, so there are all these kind of hidden consequences to technology as a solution. And one way of thinking about technology, I think a better way of thinking about technology, is that it's not a solution. It's actually, this idea of the trickster. It's basically a trickster. It's like it's a trick, basically. And that the consequences of it are always much more complex and difficult to imagine than we have the foresight to see in advance. So, the simple answer to that question is we might invent something. It's a big bet to make. It's like betting the lives of our children and our grandchildren and our planet on that. And I think even if we do, it won't be as simple as we've got a technical solution now, we can all relax and go home.
But that actually brings up the first question also, which is, so we discussed, you were talking about unintended consequences, and people are mining for the pieces for our laptops and things. So in a similar way, right now, without electricity, or without right now, India is actually needing some of those things to, in essence, hopefully for the people who need them the most. So how do we find a balance between the fact that it's not actually the global South's, we did not really make this happen, and we're the ones who will actually suffer the most. The Black and brown people are going to be the ones who suffer the most. So what's the balance between us actually trying to get people out of poverty and not tell people, like, you can't have a fridge, you cannot use the AC?
That question to some extent goes to the heart and the crux of the complexity of the challenge, which is that absolutely, the global South did not cause climate change. And that if you look at, the average emissions profile of an individual in India versus an individual in the US, it's obviously many, many times less. And one way I kind of imagine is that, all the people who talk about a population problem, it's a bit like, well, if you look at it from a consumption and emissions point of view, it's the US that's overpopulated, because each one of those individuals, it's Europe that's overpopulated because each one of those individuals has an emissions profile 10 times that, or more than that, of someone in the global South. So I think absolutely there's a problem that has been caused, if you like, by the West historically, and by modernity, industrialization. I think the challenge is that the global South has embraced that paradigm as the way to go. So, India shining, and the whole promise of industrialization that, Nehru kind of started, if you like, that we're going to industrialize, we're going to become an industrial nation. And China embraced that idea as well, the second largest emitter in the world now. And I think the way to look at it is that even though historically the global South hasn't caused the problem, the bulk of global emissions, so over 50% of all historic human emissions, have happened in our lifetimes. So they've happened since 1992. It's not that the bulk of these emissions happened in the 1800s during, the peak era of colonialism. They've happened in our lifetimes, and they've happened because the globe and, the South and, the countries of the global North have all embraced industrialization as a paradigm that is worth pursuing, and is the only paradigm worth pursuing. So really, the idea that someone living in rural India needs an air conditioner and a fridge is an idea that has been sold. And the problem with selling that idea is obviously the consequences of that idea. Now, having sold the idea, we can't say to people, sorry, we didn't mean it. You can't really have it. I can have it. You can have it, but we didn't mean it. Sorry, we screwed up. We sold you this whole dream, this whole picture, this whole development paradigm that, you too can be developed. But sorry, that was a kind of an error. But that's what we've done, basically. We've sold everyone this kind of paradigm and this picture, essentially, of, high energy lifestyles that consume the planet as being where we should all be going and where we should all be heading. And so, the tragedy of the situation is that, people in the West, people in, the US and Canada and the UK that accept the reality of the challenge are now trying to reverse gear rapidly. So they're trying to decrease the impact of their lifestyles rapidly through all sorts of things. And they're trying to backpedal, if you like. And so the problem is that, are we backpedaling fast enough? And then the problem becomes, what is an appropriate paradigm, what is an appropriate pathway for people who are living in poverty, who do not have enough? And I think the challenge is that, we don't have a destination that is attractive to people other than the high energy industrial lifestyles that have been sold to us over the last 50 years or so. I remember living in India as a kid and having, 4 channels, right? And basically, and a black and white TV. And I remember, my friends who had color TVs and kind of thinking, well, they have a color TV, but it's a bit like, it's always comparative, right? It's like, okay, my life wasn't particularly terrible because we had a black and white TV, partly because there was nothing on Doordarshan that I wanted to watch anyway. But, it's not as if like I really had to have a color TV for the quality of but it's a comparative thing. It's like you feel less because it's like, why do all these people have this? So I think the problem is, what are we aspiring to and what have we sold in terms of, an aspirational dream? I think the problem is that it's exactly what you're saying, is the impact is disproportionate. It's black, it's brown people, it's in the global south. So it's a problem we have to deal with. We can't not deal with it. It's not going to go away. It's going to get worse, and it will get orders of magnitude worse because of our own developmental paradigms, because the global south has also embraced the industrial paradigm. So if we basically say, okay, we want equity to pollute, we want equality, we want the right to pollute, then essentially, we're just going to push. It's a bit like, pushing us off the cliff a little bit faster, basically. And that's a ridiculous thing to do. It's a bit like, I want the right to blow up the planet. And it's like, okay, sure, you can fight for that right, but really? Is that really where we want to go?
When people ask you, Zaid, why have we put the onus back on the individual or the citizen? I know that there is these, basically they're called conference of parties, the COPs, where governments do come together. Obviously, we know that they're very slow in whatever they're doing. And again, it's falling back to the individual. So sort of continuing that conversation, one, we're asking individuals to change. And again, it just so happens to be that it's mostly the black and brown people again. So how do you respond to that?
I think this idea that it's about individual behavior change is part of the problem, and part of the atomization in the West in terms of society, families, and so on means that it is a hyper-individualistic society, and the unit of change, if you like, becomes the individual. And I think that is a problem. And it's a problem because one of the things about complex challenges and systemic challenges is that often the burden of those challenges falls on the individual. So, the price that has to be paid, the cost, the consequences are borne by the individual. But the cause of those is often institutional, and it's being driven by institutional decisions that then obviously, institutions are basically saying, well, we're responding to demand for services or supply. But I think the unit of change being the individual is hugely problematic and is really not going to work. And I think it's not going to work because, as you say, the pressure on people and the load on people, if you like, is going up. So if we think about the consequences of climate change, then on top of the actual need to mitigate and change the situation, you can't say to individuals, look, we know that you're going through a heat wave and that agriculture is failing and that you're finding it hard to feed yourselves and your families, but we have another problem we'd like you to take on. And the problem is we'd like you to transform industrial society and change civilization and basically cut down global emissions by 90%. You can't do that, basically. It's a ridiculous thing to do. So part of the failure, I think, is that we have an institutional failure. That, the bulk of global emissions have happened since 1992, since the first Conference of Parties, since the announcement of the UNFCCC, since we have known the science of the climate crisis. So we have in full knowledge of what is happening and what the consequences are, emitted 50% of historical emissions in the last 30 years or so. That shows us that there's an institutional problem as well, that our institutions are essentially failing to respond to the crisis. They're failing to recognize the reality of the problem and hoping that they can get away with, or I would call business as usual. So I think the real problem is not individual behavior change, but is institutional behavior change, which is, how do institutions, corporations, governments, NGOs, and even, I would say the climate NGOs and NGOs working in the conservation space and so on. So I remember sort of when the financial crisis was happening in 2008, working for one of the big global kind of conservation organizations, one of the bingos, and we were looking at the financial system. And one of the things we discovered was that, all of their capital was sitting with HSBC, and it was sitting with one of the banks, and there were no real capital screens on how that money was being used. So now fast forward to some work that I was doing a couple of years ago. We're working for a big foundation, and this foundation had an endowment of, $3 or $4 billion. So this endowment was given to Deutsche Bank, and Deutsche Bank invested that endowment and then gave them a return. So they got a return, and they spent about 100 million a year in sort of grants and, what foundations typically do. Now, here's kind of the picture, and I'm exaggerating just a little bit, right? So it's a bit like you've taken $3 billion and you've given it to a bank, and you've said, invest this in coal and fossil fuels and maximize my profit. And they kind of go, sure. So they go invest that in coal and fossil fuels. Then you get 100 million a year back. You take that 100 million and you break it down into tiny, tiny grants, and you give it to small grassroots NGOs, and you say to them, we want you to solve the climate crisis. And they go, okay, well, I'll take my $100,000 or $50,000 or whatever it is, and I will make a heroic attempt to tackle the climate crisis. But the part they're missing is that that money is coming from underwriting and financing the climate crisis with $3 billion. And it's a bit like, hang on a minute, there's a problem here. This is completely insane. So somebody is financing the climate crisis. Somebody is basically banking that money, distributing it as dividends to their shareholders, and profiting from it. And that is the system we live in, basically, where the NGOs are being underwritten by profits from fossil fuels, from emissions, from old tech, if you like, that is actually polluting. And those institutions are just focused on profit maximization. So how is it that, the philanthropic sector in the US, and the philanthropic, which is bigger than the Department of Defense in terms of sector size, has no investment screens on its capital? I mean, that is not a practice that is widespread. It's becoming more common that, an organization basically says, we're divesting from fossil fuels, and everyone goes, wow, you're divesting from fossil fuels. That's amazing. And it's a bit like, how is that amazing? That is the least you could be doing. There is billions of dollars of capital from the philanthropic sector underwriting the climate, underwriting the causes of the climate crisis. It doesn't make any sense. So to say that the onus should be on individuals to change, the onus should be on Black people and brown people to change, is nonsense.
What's the new story of climate change? I mean, if it's not the individual, if we are actually going after the institutions, what's that story?
Well, I think the story has to be that the unit of change is not the individual, it's the team or the group. That actually what we need is teams of people, groups of people that have some muscle, if you like, right? So they're able to do things that individuals aren't able to do. But really, those teams and those groups have to take on the burden of shift and change. And those teams and groups have to come from civil society, from the private sector, from corporations, from government, from local government, and they have to learn how to work together. And this is the other thing about, the institutional failure that we're talking about is it's an institutional failure to work together, really. Institutions are not good at partnering. They're good at transactions. They're good at buying things, the buying and selling kind of services, but they're not good at partnering with each other, with working as a team. And, it's a little bit like having a football team where nobody knows how to pass the ball. It's just ridiculous. It's like, you can't do that. That's a terrible team. It's like, no, I'm going to keep the ball and I'm just going to play. And it's a bit like, you've got a football team where everyone's just playing their own game, and it doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. So what I'm basically saying is that, the onus has to be on institutions to shift their behavior, to shift their cultures, to shift what they do, to learn new capabilities, to learn new skills. And, to do that in the context of a team, basically, that, you've got to practice, you've got to work as a team, you've got to learn new capabilities and skills, and you've got to stop doing what you've always done because it doesn't work.
How do we translate that for India, Zaid? Let's come back to India for a second. Let's talk about what you're saying, because I do see people trying to work on conservation and climate change. And obviously, we are up against some very powerful forces. Capitalism being one of them, which we've already sort of not named, and I'm just naming now, but we referred to. So what is it in India that we should be looking at? How bad of a situation are we in India? What's sort of the science saying? And then a very small thing, when we're talking about solutions at some point, we'll have to discuss mitigation versus adaptation, especially with emissions. So at a very, sort of overview level. So what should we be doing?
What we actually need to do is we need to deploy our capital differently. So if you're the government of India and you're basically saying, we want to create jobs, then what are you paying people to do? And one of the things about all of these sectors, the technology sector, Silicon Valley, all of these things is that they all got to where they got to because of public subsidy and public money. So they did not do it themselves. So, there's this economist at UCL and she has this great diagram of an iPhone, and she shows that every component in the iPhone was essentially subsidized by public money. I mean, the initial research for every single component happened in the public domain. I think, we have to recognize that, ultimately, the private sector looks to government as a backstop. So, when the financial crisis happened, it was government that bailed people out. And the bottom line with all of those bailouts is it is public debt. So to you and me, we are paying for these institutions screwing up, basically. So what I'm saying is that I think the public sector has to use its capital and its muscle differently to basically say, sorry, we're actually not going to subsidize fossil fuels. We're not going to subsidize companies that are polluting. Actually, we're going to redeploy this capital. And the question and the challenge becomes, how do you redeploy such large amounts of capital? That's actually the problem. The problem isn't, do we have the capital? The problem is, how does the Indian government say, okay, well, we want to spend, $1 billion or $250 million and we want to create jobs for people on the ground. How do we do that? Which is a very different problem to basically saying that, that farmer can't buy a fridge.
So now after speaking for about 30 minutes, I'm very frustrated and I'm feeling very confused. So my question is, what do we do now? So we've outlined this big problem. It's complex, as you said. It's like changing ingrained institutions, which is not going to be easy work. How do we do this, Zaid? What do you think that we should be doing right now? Like in India and also globally, because now I'm feeling like, well, this is beyond me. This is like something that I cannot manage.
I don't want to grossly oversimplify it, but let me put it this way, right? So, we've launched something called the Gigaton Challenge, and the goal of the Gigaton Challenge is to reduce global emissions by 1 billion tons a year. Now, 1 billion tons a year is what we need to do. It's probably a little bit more now, but that's globally what we need to do, which is an extremely tall order. So 1 billion tons a year is all of Africa's emissions in a year, or just over all of Germany's emissions in a year. So how do we do that? It's beyond us.
So it's called the Gigaton Challenge, and the idea is to reduce 1 gigaton per year. For how long?
So, the science is saying we need to reduce a gigaton a year for at least 50 years until we hit zero, basically. And that's what the science is saying. And that target is absolutely and utterly beyond us as any individual or even any institution. It's not going to happen if we look to individuals for behavior change and if we say, let's take on this kind of burden. So you and I are not going to do it. So what I'm basically saying is that the way to do it is in fact, it's actually quite simple, right? And I want to explain kind of the numbers first very quickly and then the practicality of it. So, here are the numbers, right? So 1 billion tons is 1,000 megatons. And if we had 1,000 teams, we'd need to reduce, 1,000 teams would need to reduce 1 megaton each. A megaton is about 300,000 cars coming off the road every year. So that's a huge target, very difficult to do. But if we had 2,000 teams, the target would drop by half. So the team would then have to do 0.5 of a megaton. So the math is really simple. The more teams you have attempting the same target, the easier it gets, basically. So the more people that we have actually trying to do the work and committing to achieving these results, practically the easier it's going to get.
So let's just take a step back and understand exactly what you mean by teams also. So what is the approach that you're talking about?
Well, so I guess what I'm trying to say is let's start with the target. So let's basically say that, we have thousands of teams across the world, and these teams have a goal, and their goal is to, reduce emissions by a certain amount, whatever that amount is. The question becomes, what's the ideal team to do the work? Like, who do we want to do the work? Who should be doing the work in Bangalore? Who should be doing the work in Delhi? Who should be doing the work, wherever in Berlin? And what I'm basically saying is that, the team, when I talk about team, has to be constituted of diverse parts of society. It can't just be a bunch of school kids saying, yes, we're going to do this, even though that's what's needed. What we need teams where we have civil society present, local government present, we have, corporations present, so these are essentially kind of multi-sectoral teams, and that's where we need to head. And, making those teams work it's the same as making any team work, any team, a football team, a cricket team. It's like, you have to practice. And if you practice, you'll make it work, basically. To take kind of the overwhelm of, this massive, global, complex, systemic problem, we can reduce it to your membership of a team. Are you part of a team that is attempting to tackle the climate crisis? And what are you doing, basically? And if the answer is yes, I'm part of a team that's doing something about it, and what I'm trying to do is X or Y or Z, then we have a solution.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah, so we have a team that started in Vizag, and this is it's a local kabaddi team, so it's a team of sports players, and they basically signed up to Gigaton, and we set them a target of reducing emissions by 1 ton of CO2. And they decided to focus on food waste. So they basically had to prevent 400 kilos of food going to landfill. And they came up with a combination of things. So there was some cooked food that was getting thrown away. So they redistributed that to poorer families. And then organic food waste, they basically composted. And they achieved their target. Then they attempted a 10-ton target. So they had to reduce, they had to essentially ensure 4 tons of food didn't end up in landfill. And they did that. Now, the thing is, the interesting thing about this team is that, they understand the notion of practice, right? So they're a team, sports team, they practice all the time. And so what we're saying to them is, look, we want you to practice 10 tons, then we want you to practice 100 tons, then we want you to do 1,000 tons, and we want you to up the numbers. And to some extent, they have a really good chance of doing it because they're sports people. They're just like, yeah, sure, we will practice. And if we succeed and hit a goal, we'll take a next goal. And they're not overthinking it. They're not kind of going, oh, but how does this add up to a global response to the climate crisis? They're just doing their part. And they're doing it on the ground. They're doing it locally. And my guess is that if we have thousands of teams doing that, then suddenly we have something that's really interesting. And now the thing about this team is that this is the kind of, again, crux of the debate in the climate crisis, in the climate policy space, is that, one of the debates, so the debate when I went to kind of Cannes to Austria all those years ago was between free market mechanisms and state-based mechanisms. So it's a bit like, should the state be funding this? Should the market be funding this? And the thing is, it's kind of it's a deep, contentious debate. But the way I'm kind of seeing it is that if you think about this team in Vizag, the question is, should they be paid for doing that work, right? And I'm a bit like, well, all of these people going to the COP, so all these 5,000 people that go to negotiate, are they getting paid to do the work? Well, obviously they're getting paid to do the work, right? They're all paid. They all have a job. So if they're paid to do the work, then why aren't these guys being paid to do the work? So they should be paid to do the work. Now, the mechanism by which they should be paid, frankly, I don't care. It's like, come up with a mechanism. Like, when a delegate turns up to the COP and they're from a nonprofit, what is the mechanism by which they're being funded? And in some cases, the mechanism is what I described to you, that they're being funded by philanthropy that is actually investing in fossil fuels. And I'm a bit like, you're not particularly worried about that. So why are you worried about this? So I'm not suggesting that, we should basically set up a fund, invest in fossil fuels, and then hire these teams. I think we can do much better than that. And I think some of these teams will be teams that will spin off to become for-profit waste collection companies, where they'll charge big hotels or big institutions to take their food waste and compost it. And some of them will be non-profit. But the point I'm trying to make is that any industry in history that has arisen and succeeded was subsidized by the public sector, right? So why are we not subsidizing? Why would we not subsidize these teams through public sector funds? And yes, they can spin off eventually to become private sector companies, or, maybe like South India will develop a massive, waste disposal industry, and that will be private, but that's okay. the point of public sector funding is to make strategic and risky investments, and to make investments that the private sector refuses to make or will not make. So really, like, that complexity and, the overwhelm of this being kind of global and these numbers that are ginormous, what it boils down to is, can we take 15, 20, 30 people in Bangalore, multiply that by 10, 100, 1,000, and pay them to do things that are beneficial to our planet?
Sounds like the dream.
Right. And really, there are lots of kind of technical or tactical difficulties in doing that, but it's actually not that difficult to do. And that's where I would kind of say that we have to cut through kind of the noise and the confusion and the, overwhelm, and actually say, well, actually, there are strategies that we can pursue. There are things we can do, and we need to find the imagination to picture them, and we need to find the will to do them.
Sweta, Zaid, thank you so much for joining us on BIC Talks. It was an absolute pleasure to have you both talking about the climate crisis and what we can actually do ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share this episode with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app, and don't miss out on future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.